Everyone knows the script. Graduate by 22, stable career by 25. Relationships, maybe a ring, maybe a mortgage, all locked in by 30. And if you hit all those marks, people call you successful. They nod, they approve, they stop asking uncomfortable questions at family dinners. But there is an entire group of people who reach 30, and none of that has happened. Not because they failed, not because they didn't try, but because somewhere along the way, they realized the script wasn't written for them. And the fascinating thing? Psychologists have been studying this group, and what they are finding completely reframes what success actually means. Picture this. You are somewhere in your late 20s, maybe 28, maybe 31, and someone, a relative, a coworker, or an old friend from school, asks the question, "So, what are you doing now?" And you answer. And then there is this pause, this tiny, loaded silence, because your answer does not fit neatly into a category they recognize. You are not climbing a corporate ladder. You might not own property. Maybe you are still figuring out what kind of work actually means something to you. And instead of feeling proud of the fact that you haven't settled, you feel this background hum of shame, like you are running behind, like the race already started, and somehow you missed the gun. Here is what nobody tells you about that feeling. It is not evidence that something went wrong. It is actually one of the most psychologically complex positions a person can occupy in modern life. To understand why this feels so heavy, you have to go back to where the idea of success by 30 came from in the first place. The 30-year milestone is not ancient wisdom. It is a product of a very specific economic moment in the post-World War II. Boom, roughly 1945 to 1975. Stable manufacturing jobs were abundant, university degrees were affordable, and housing prices were low relative to income. A 22-year-old entering the workforce in 1955 could realistically own a home, start a family, and achieve career stability all within 1 decade. The timeline worked because the economy was built to support it. That economy no longer exists. Research from the Pew Research Center found that millennials, people born between 1981 and 1996, were the first generation in modern American history to earn less than their parents at the same age. Adjusted for inflation, entry-level wages have stagnated since the 1970s, while housing costs have increased by over 118% in the last 30 years. The timeline was preserved, but the conditions that made it possible were quietly removed. And here is what is fascinating. Despite all of that, the 30-year script is still treated as the baseline for a normal adult life, which means an entire generation of people, millions of them, are measuring themselves against a standard that was designed for a world that no longer exists. Now, here is where the psychology gets genuinely interesting. When a person reaches a culturally expected milestone, a promotion, a wedding, or a first home, the brain triggers a dopamine release associated with social validation. You feel good, not just because you achieved the thing, but because you achieved it in front of other people. Belonging is activated, approval is confirmed. But that same system, the one wired for social approval, can work against you when your life path diverges from the expected one. A 2022 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people who experienced significant delays in reaching traditional adult milestones reported higher rates of what researchers called timeline anxiety. This is a chronic, low-grade stress response rooted not in their actual circumstances, but in the gap between where they are and where they believe they should be. Timeline anxiety is not about your life. It is about your life compared to an imaginary version of your life. The damage is not coming from your choices. It is coming from the story you inherited about what your choices should look like. Think about that for a second, and this is where it gets really interesting. The same 2022 study found something else buried in the data. People who experienced delayed traditional milestones and who eventually came to terms with their non-linear path reported significantly higher scores on measures of psychological flexibility, identity clarity, and long-term life satisfaction compared to people who had hit every milestone on schedule. But the people who took longer were not behind. They were building something different. something the researchers struggled to quantify because the metrics were designed to measure a different kind of life. Here is the paradox at the center of all this: the very traits that make it harder to hit the 30-year milestone on time, deep questioning, discomfort with meaningless work, and a refusal to settle for a version of life that does not feel authentic, are the same traits associated with what psychologists call identity complexity. And identity complexity, it turns out, is one of the strongest predictors of psychological resilience, creative problem solving, and adaptive thinking in adulthood. A 2019 study from Northwestern University found that people with high identity complexity were significantly less likely to engage in rigid us versus them thinking. They were more likely to seek out diverse perspectives and better equipped to navigate ambiguity, which, if you have looked at the world recently, is basically the core skill of modern life. But here is the part that explains everything. Identity complexity takes time. It cannot be rushed, and it is almost never achieved by people who are busy hitting milestones on schedule. Because hitting milestones on schedule requires a different kind of focus: execution, compliance, and speed. Not questioning, not depth, not the slow, sometimes painful process of figuring out who you actually are underneath the person everyone expected you to become. Now, here is what surprised even the researchers studying this. Psychologist Erik Erikson argued that the primary psychological task of early adulthood is not success. It is identity formation. And Erikson was clear: for many people, this process cannot be completed on a cultural timeline. Some people need longer, not because they are struggling, but because they are going deeper. More recently, psychologist Jeffrey Arnett expanded on this with his concept of emerging adulthood. He studied thousands of young adults and found that those who spent longer in this exploratory phase, trying different paths and questioning inherited values, developed more stable, self-authored identities than those who simply accepted what was handed to them. Your delayed success is not a malfunction. It might be the system working exactly as it should, just on your timeline, not the one printed on the calendar. Here is what society calls you if you haven't hit the marks by 30. Lost? Aimless? A late bloomer, a phrase that is meant as a compliment, but arrives with a barely concealed implication that you were supposed to bloom earlier. But here is what the actual psychological research calls you: complex, flexible, self-determining. The people who refuse to measure their worth by a timeline designed for a post-war economy are not failing at life. They are, in many cases, doing something genuinely harder. They are building an identity from scratch, without the scaffolding of external validation. They are sitting inside uncertainty long enough to know what they actually value, not what they were told to value. And that is not a small thing. That is, by nearly every meaningful psychological measure, an act of extraordinary intellectual courage. There is a reason why some of the most transformative thinkers, artists, and builders across history reached their most significant work long after 30, not in spite of the delay, because of it. Because they spent those extra years developing something that cannot be rushed: a deep, self-generated sense of what matters. Your life is not behind schedule. It is running on a different kind of clock, one that is not broken, one that was never meant to match the one on the wall. If this resonated with you, it is probably because some part of you already knew this. You just needed someone to say it without dressing it up as advice. You don't need to fix your timeline. You need to stop measuring your life against a clock that was never built for you. If this landed somewhere real, I think you will want to watch our video on the psychology of people who deleted social media, because the same refusal to follow a script runs all the way through it. And if no one has told you lately, you are not behind. You are just taking the longer road. And the longer road, more often than not, leads somewhere worth arriving. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on my future uploads.